Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum where experts provide clear, data-driven insight into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. As the campaign season heats up, we're kicking off an intermittent series that will examine some of the candidates' most sweeping policy proposals. We're going to start today looking at the issue of student loan debt. And joining us to break it down is AAF's president, Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, welcome back, and thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure. I wore my best podcast tie for the occasion.
It's a great tie. So let's start by looking at a plan put forth by presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders from my home state of Vermont. Bernie, true to his character, goes big. Not only does he want...
Well, if you come from a little state, you tend to... Never mind.
Big ideas, little states, huh? Not only does he want to cancel student debt for all students, he suggests that public college should be free for all students. Doug, I know you've given this issue a lot of thought, especially since you've worked in higher education, and I know you have many significant concerns. What problem is this trying to address?
I don't know, to be honest. There are a couple of different assertions. One is that the $1.6 trillion in student debt is a burden on those individuals and thus the economy. Relieved of that debt, they would literally, there's some of these claims where they would start small businesses, they would, spend whatever, buy homes, this is somehow crippling their economic activity. I think that's a really short-sighted view of this, because that $1.6 trillion in debt is an obligation to pay somebody else $1.6 trillion. If you cancel it, someone else is now $1.6 trillion poorer, and they diminish their economic activity commensurately. So you can't just look at one side of this equation. So I don't know what they're trying to solve with that.
Yeah. So what problems do you think might arise by just saying we're going to cancel all student debt?
I think there are a lot of problems. You can look at it from really two perspectives. One would be sort of basic issues of fairness. Does this feel fair? I don't think it does. You're canceling the debt equally for those who are doing fine and repaying. You're doing it for rich versus poor. All of that feels unfair to me. It's also true that the United States government is a very, very active lender. There are farm loans. There are small business loans. There are loans of all sorts. Why these loans? Why shouldn't we just cancel everyone's loans? So that doesn't seem fair. I can imagine a lot of people saying, hey, what about me? So I don't think this passes a laugh test on the fairness front. But the bigger problems are on the sort of policy and incentives front. First is, what does this do to any future lending program? Do people now go into it with an expectation that there's some chance they won't ever have to pay it back? That's a terrible expectation to set. And I think that's a big mistake. It then also doesn't do one bit of good to get people into college. This is old loans. It's done. And you don't do anything productive economically by forgiving something in the past. And everyone's noted that this doesn't change the structure of higher education at all. It doesn't change the incentives to produce high-value education for your tuition. So it doesn't deal with the real problem. The real reason we have a lot of debt is college is expensive. Deal with that.
Right. And I think a lot of us on the right also, I think, rightly point out, how do you pay for something like this? Who's going to foot the bill for this? Let's take a quick listen to how Senator Bernie Sanders says he's going to pay for it.
Who's going to pay for canceling that debt? Is it going to be people who haven't gone to college?
No. I will pay for it. It's very clear. It is going to be a tax on Wall Street. 10 years ago, we bailed out Wall Street, whose recklessness and illegal behavior caused the worst economic downturn in the modern history of this country. And they received trillions of dollars of help from the taxpayers of this country. I think now it is Wall Street's turn to help the middle class and working families of America by ending student debt.
Doug, what are your thoughts about how Bernie is proposing to pay for this plan?
These sort of stock transaction taxes, financial transaction taxes have been proposed many times in the past. I'll ask you, how many do we have? 0. There's a reason for that. They're not a particularly good idea. They're typically dressed up in this notion that we're going to stop speculative trading. But a trade's a trade. You can't tell if the one's speculative and the other's a reasonable hedge against a future event. anything that inhibits people's ability to diversify and get rid of some risk harms them in the end. So these are taxes that I think aren't at the top of anyone's list from an economics point of view, and they've never made it over the political finish line. It looks like an empty promise to me.
Mm-hmm. So now let's take a listen to a similar proposal by presidential candidate Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. Let's listen in.
That's why I'm calling for universal free college and the cancellation of student loan debt of up to $50,000 for 42 million Americans. My plan will wipe out student loan debt entirely for about 75% of those with debt. It will help close the racial wealth gap, and it will provide an enormous economic boost to America's middle class. The cost of my universal college and debt cancellation plan can be covered entirely by my ultra millionaires wealth tax. That's a 2% tax on the richest 75,000 fortunes in this country, those with more than $50 million in assets. Just 2%, and we can do this.
Wow, that one even came with some inspirational music. By the way, there was some debate on whether I could be able to say the word wow in a entertaining way, but I think I nailed it.
Well, we'll wait for the reviews.
Moving on. Aside from that, are there noteworthy differences between Sanders and Warren's plans?
Yeah, I think on both sides. The pay for, let's start with that, very different. She's proposed a wealth tax on affluent individuals. This is, again, something we've never really had in the United States. It has been tried in Europe without great success. It's very difficult to actually collect the tax that she's advertising because it's pretty easy to break up large concentrations of wealth, at least on paper, split it across members of a family, things like that. So I'm not sure anyone's really believing the numbers that are out there. And on the proposal itself, it's less ambitious, if it's fair to describe anything of hers as less ambitious, in that it only forgives $50,000 worth of debt for those under $100,000 in income. It phases out up to $250,000. So if you make more than that, you get no debt relief. So it's more targeted in that sense. Feels fairer from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. So wrapping up our discussion about the candidates' plans here, is it helpful just to think, are these real proposals or are these just more campaign rhetoric?
I think, having been on a campaign,
right,
that you can never dismiss something as just campaign rhetoric. The candidate has chosen to go out and say this is important. And that act in and of itself merits attention. So both have placed a lot of attention on going to college and the cost of going to college. I don't think the things they have proposed are realistic. I don't think they're going to make either of those two things, the college going rate or the cost of it, improve in the United States. But what they've chosen to focus on is important.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn our attention now to the problems of higher education more broadly. A lot of people are talking both about rising debt levels and the rising price tag of college. Are these the biggest and most fundamental problems, or do you see others?
I think it's going to be really interesting over the next decade to watch what goes on in higher education. It has had the feel of the healthcare sector for a while. You've got a sector that produces a product of highly uneven quality. It gets ever more expensive, and there's tons of federal money being channeled into it. And people start getting upset about all three of those things. In the absence of some real pressure, though, they don't change. And we don't have really great levers to tell a university to perform differently. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you look at the demography, there are fewer students coming out of high school to go to colleges. And we're starting to see the stories already about smaller liberal arts colleges getting in trouble financially, maybe going out of business. So the competitive landscape is going to be changing over the next decade. Will those colleges take the opportunity to say, hey, this is a place where you will get value for your dollar and a job when you're done. We can demonstrate it. Here's the value proposition. That's been missing. I know of one notable example of that already, which is Purdue University, where the new president, Mitch Daniels, has not raised tuition during his tenure. And
he's been there for a while, right?
That's 6 years, and that's a phenomenal accomplishment.
And going back to your point about these small liberal arts colleges, there's been a few stories from my hometown, my home state of Vermont, where a bunch of colleges are facing shutdown. Yeah. A college my dad coached basketball at had just shut down this year. So it's definitely something that I think is going to be there. And I think it brings up this interesting issue that's out there about a higher education bubble. I mean, you hear a lot of people talk about this in the news. What do you make of this description?
Well, there's been, a long-standing notion of are you getting actual skills or is it just credentials? Like you've got a high school diploma, that's not as good as having a college diploma, but your skills aren't really that different. I think what we're going to see is increasing emphasis on actual skills and less emphasis on credentials. And so some of those colleges are going to have to make sure they're delivering graduates who can get a job right away and be successful.
Mm-hmm. You've touched a little bit on this, but how much has government policy contributed to both the rising debt and the rising prices?
I think they're one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we have a federal loan policy that is exactly this complicated. Would you like some money? Sure, here. That's it. There's no due diligence done of the type that a private lender would have to do, mm-hmm. and then say, okay, Kyle, where are you planning to go? And mm-hmm. what are you going to take?
Right.
Oh, that's a good bet. Well, yeah,
mm-hmm.
be happy to finance that. We don't do anything like that. It's an underwriting system designed to produce bad loans. It produces bad loans, but that's money just being poured into that university system, and they don't have to work hard to get it.
Mm-hmm. So how much do you think alternative education, such as vocational school, should be part of this conversation?
There's no question the idea that there's a one-size-fits-all liberal arts track for every child born in the United States, we know that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
People are always really surprised to find out that a majority of Americans don't go to college. So those vocational skills are actually the most important thing to the majority of Americans. Mm-hmm. We should be paying attention to that.
Yeah, my sister's actually about to enroll in the Culinary Institute of America because she wants to be a baker, and going to a liberal arts college just doesn't make sense for her. So I hope that is part of the continued solution.
Has she ever thought about doing candies? Candies are way more promising.
Maybe I can convince her to start her own brand of Twizzlers
that
for you.
That would be fantastic.
What other solutions do you see to this problem?
I think that in the end, this will get driven by the need to control the federal dollars. And once you cut off that sort of infinite ability to tap the federal treasury, then you're tapping America's families, and they're going to be a lot more cost conscious, and that'll put a lot of pressure on the schools.
Okay, so wrapping up here today, let's switch gears. Last episode, we had AAF's Gordon Gray on to talk about the three key things Congress must absolutely do before the end of this year, which was, raising the debt limit, funding the government, which we'll have to see how that plays out yet again, and reauthorizing several key expiring programs. Assuming for a moment, and I know this is a big assumption, that you're a glass half full kind of guy, what additional legislation do you think Congress must come together and pass in a bipartisan way this year? Something on healthcare, immigration, maybe tech privacy.
I would have put prescription drug legislation at the top of the likely list. Mm-hmm. Almost everyone feels like something has to happen, and there are some genuinely beneficial things that require legislation and would be helpful. So that's one. There are still bills working through energy, commerce, ways and means, help committee in the Senate, finance. So I remain hopeful on that front. Privacy legislation, if only to run off the prospect of having 50 different privacy regimes imposed by state legislatures. So I thought that was actually pretty likely to happen too, but that seems to have less momentum. We shall see.
We shall see. Doug, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. I'd also like to encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes from this episode, and also follow us on social media to hear more about AAF.